welcome to London. This is my office in London, and Pippa and I are here to talk about this book, The New Stone Age, which I wrote because I wanted to have a look at our crystal and stone obsessions from the ancients to the present day. And Pippa and I are both great stone and crystal devotees. You can see Pippa's actually, she wears most of her stones constantly around her neck and around, she sort of clinks around. You certainly know when she's coming. Me, I tend to have them more around me, placed. I don't know if you can see, I've got amethyst here, I've got celestite, I've got malachite, turquoise. And probably like a lot of us, and probably like we were just listening to the previous talk, I do have something like a little piece of black tourmaline, which I keep around my computer to lessen the electromagnetic stress that comes our way. I have a piece of pyrite that slightly inspires me on my desk. Pyre, meaning fire, sort of trying to ignite the success inside you. But actually, I think the connection with stones for all of us is much more deep and primal. I think there's this very strong connection to nature. And I think the pandemic, if it's shown anything to us, is that we require that connection to nature. I think that they lift your spirits, they make you curious, it makes you understand your place in the world. And I think as obsessions go, stones have been the first and arguably our most enduring that we're all still following now. It's the most ancient of our beliefs that comes down through the generations, through the millennia. And so I'm very happy to be here to discuss that with Pippa today, who is the best person to talk about, because not only is she a jewelry designer, but she's also an anthropologist.
I loved reading the book, I have to say. I found it so interesting, in part because, of course, you go through the properties of the stones and people's experience with those stones, but also I love the fact you really looked into why we do this, why are we doing it today when we live in a different world from the Stone Age. What made you write the book?
Well, there were several different factors. One is the day job, doing what I do and working with stones for so many years. I think you do realize that each one of them is individual. They all have their own fingerprint. And I think I've been around stone cutters and polishers enough to know when they describe it to me and they say, well, we only cut rubies in the morning because otherwise we're too energetic and we can't sleep at night. So we cut them in the morning and then we'll do something like emeralds in the afternoon because that's softer and helps us to sleep. So you know that there is an energy, a feeling that people are picking up from these stones. And I also cut diamonds years ago in Antwerp with Gabi Tolkowski, the great diamond cutter. Wow. And he said he doesn't touch a stone until he's spoken to it for a long time and got to know it. Yeah. And he said, I ask them, what do you want to be? Yeah. And when they talk back to me, I know that. And so I think being around the stones so much made me think about it. I think the stones journey, this sort of extraordinary geological upheavals, erosion of mountains, this extraordinary physical event that happens, that stones survive. And I think that gives them, for me, an aura of magic. And then I called it the New Stone Age because I genuinely felt there was a movement in the 21st century, whether it was art collectors, I think in objects, in jewelry, in beauty, certainly in the fashion crowd, the Victoria Beckhams, Charlotte Tilbury. I mean, so many names of people who've absorbed crystals into their life, but also just ordinary people, just just other people, young people, I think, who were sort of crusading to save the planet, who were wearing crystals. So I genuinely felt there was a new movement that should be investigated and explored. And I think the final reason was that 2 years ago, I wrote a story for Vogue called The Master Healers. And I went and had a crystal reading in Los Angeles. And I thought, I really want to know what I think about the energetic value of a stone. What's real? What isn't? Can we really prove or disprove that there's a sort of spiritual, energetic value to them? And so I set out on this journey to find out what I thought.
And what did you find?
Well, I found that there is, I think, there are things we can prove. There's stones attract us through light, which is color. It comes to us in a form of color. And you can prove the light. You can test the light. I think you can test the thermal properties which change. If you touch a stone and it's cold to start with, and it'll absorb the warmth from your hands. So you can test these properties. And these are, light and heat are things that are proven stimulants to us as human beings. So we are going to be attracted by that. There's no doubt as well that atoms do vibrate. That doesn't mean to say there's any spiritual energy there. What can't be proven is the reaction to an individual to a particular stone and their synergy. And that is a personal reaction.
That's the magic, really.
So that is the magic that happens. And but I think in that there is the placebo effect, and people talk about that. They say, oh, it's just placebo, but that doesn't matter, because there is a very robust point in our culture. The placebo has a therapeutic effect. And I talked to lots of women about their experiences, including Pippa, who told me all about your experience with turquoise, particular blue stones.
I mean, turquoise is interesting because I have been a traveler for, well, most of my life. I mean, certainly the last 30 years I've been traveling constantly, working in different countries and cultures. And I have since childhood collected stones. In fact, I think, like most children, I went around with pockets bulging with pebbles from the beach, or gathered it from driveways or wherever, particularly places like in the woods or places where I felt very happy. I'd pick up a stone and keep it with me. And I think I only started making jewelry literally to keep those stones without losing them. I was always losing my favorite stones. So it's kind of like drill it or set it, and that's the beginning of my career. But turquoise in particular, I think, is very much a living stone. I know in Tibet they talk about turquoise being alive or dead, and you can see two pieces. One is lustrous and shiny, and you can feel this kind of, I was going to say energy to it, but you can feel the life to it. And another piece might be dead, and it could be dead from exposure to chemicals or I mean, there's some beliefs that would say, you know, perhaps the owner of that stone had had an accident, or perhaps the stone had prevented the accident and had died in its stead or something. But I think turquoise is very much a living stone, and there's something, I'm looking at pieces.
You've got some beautiful pieces.
Looking at it as I speak, but there is something about the fact it changes color if it hasn't been stabilized. So as you wear it, it will darken. It can go to deep greens depending how much copper or iron in it. But there's something about the fact that it can change with wear that makes it feel very alive to me. As well as these incredible traditions from Southwest America, of course, to Iran, Tibet. It's a stone that's been revered and is sacred in so many ancient cultures. And I think the blue of the sky, of the oceans, of infinity is very reflected in the stone.
But you have a personal experience with turquoise because you travel so much.
Exactly. I think the travel is something where I would never travel without so many of my stones, but particularly without wearing a turquoise. You travel with all of them. Every airport they see me and go, oh no, that woman with all those stones beeping everywhere. And then they unwrap, they open my bag, and they're all wrapped in silk and little pouches, and they untie and they open and they look at me. tie it back out. It's just a mortifying experience. But anyway, turquoise for travelers. I mean, there's an ancient belief in Persia in particular that prevents you falling off horses and being a rider. Of course, that meant a lot too. But I think when you're traveling, there is a sense of potential danger. You're in a new environment. You're crossing landscapes. You're among strangers. So I think there's a sort of sense of potential danger that is perhaps something that we feel comfort and reassurance by having a stone that we think is going to protect us through that, or perhaps it does protect us through that. I don't know, but turquoise has always been something very important to me. And even looking in all the Mediterranean countries or the Middle East, where donkeys will wear small turquoise beads, or camels, or children, or this idea that it reflects the evil eye is also very ancient. Why the blue stone in particular, I don't know, but it's kind of been there for centuries. And the other blue that I use a lot and love is Lapis Lazuli, which is slightly personal because I've been working in Afghanistan for 12 years now, and it's such a stone from
Afghanistan.
Exactly, from Badakhshan and the ancient mines. And again, as a stone, it's such a beautiful, pure, I think impossible to see, but in the right light, a good piece of lapis glows. I mean, it just glows. There's kind of emanating something. It's the stone of truth.
It's almost like the night sky because it has little glints of pyrite.
Exactly, the gold flecks that just, it's a kind of, I don't know, it's a dreamy stone. But maybe there's something in the fact they're both opaque. They're very kind of grounding and earthy, because a translucent stone seems to me more, not frivolous, but it's sort of a more chatty stone. It's full of light and air, and the opaques are kind of heavier and stiller. They don't move, and they're kind of they're perhaps more grounding, and they feel sort of somehow reassuring in their stillness and their unchanging. Although turquoise changes, but there's something unchanging that's part of our attraction to stones. Our world is chaotic and mad, and the stone remains consistent.
It's quite
Before
comforting.
us, after us.
It's very comforting, and sort of can be quite grounding in that sense that you can rely on it because it has that sense of permanence.
Exactly.
Hence, you probably hold on to your turquoise when you're traveling because that will make you feel more secure.
Exactly.
And when I think, and I do think that helps people, there is a sort of element of believing, and if you believe that, it is a very sort of helpful asset.
Absolutely. And if you don't have it, on the contrary, it's like, it's a kind of terrible moment of feeling alone and abandoned. It's like, where's that stone? But yes, I think there is something very reassuring. It's with you, and you brought it from your home, so it contains a bit of that energy, and it's with you in your new place, and will take you safely home again. And
it's a part of home that you transport.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As well as, the amazing landscapes they came from. So I think, as you say, about this element of earth in them that's so primal. I mean, that word keeps coming back because I think there's so much instinct involved, and it's something that's so hard to articulate. I know we were going to go on to talk about, using stones and jewelry and things, but I think that's sort of related that when people come in my shop, for example, and they're looking for a stone, and they may say, is there a particular meaning to the stone? And of course there are many meanings, but sometimes I think it's something that is above and beyond language and words. It's so instinctual that the moment you try and articulate it or intellectualize it or give it a sort of presupposed meaning, you kind of take away that magic. It's sort of, which is the first stone, if I laid out 5 in front of you, that you reach
just
for?
For no reason. Just
for no reason.
Straight attraction.
Exactly. And you might hold it and look in the light and feel the weight and how it is in your hand, and you might then think, well, maybe this one is shinier, but it's that one, enough. That's it. Your connection is made, and you don't need to ponder more what it's doing or why. That's it. That's your stone.
I think you're right. And I talked to Paloma Picasso for the book about her feelings about stones, and she said, I don't have a perception about the color. It's what I want.
Yeah.
And so she doesn't sort of ascribe, well, I've got to have amethyst to calm me down, or pink quartz to. She said, I just have the color that I want, and then it does what I want.
Yeah.
Because I've chosen that stone.
Yeah. I think that's very true. I mean, one of the things that, talking of this pandemic, in our last lockdown, I received your book, and it was such an amazing, appropriate moment to be locked down at home, not traveling the world as I was used to, in a kind of moment of all plans had been cancelled, all future was absolutely blank and unsure. I must say, I found it quite a terrifying moment, certainly in the beginning, but receiving your book was so interesting because starting to read it right away, it felt so right. And so that everything was kind of, that I'd been feeling was in that book. So I just wondered, like, during the pandemic, did you have a kind of stone ritual that you practiced that kind of helped you get through this strange time we had?
Well, it was very strange that the book came out in sort of third week of lockdown, and I thought when I started the book, I couldn't have had any glimmer of an idea of how prescient it would be.
Yeah.
Because as I said earlier, that sort of feeling of wanting nature inside our spaces, because nature was taken away from us.
Yeah.
And this is one way that I felt that people could have a sort of living thing that reminded them of the earth and nature inside.
Yeah.
And plus, I do think it had that sort of calming element. And what I used is, I love rock crystal, and I don't know if you can see it. I'll just sort of hold it there. But I love rock crystal because the ancient Japanese called it the perfect jewel because it symbolized for them space, purity, and perseverance. And for me, that felt so right for lockdown.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you could see, and you probably all have rock crystal, so you know that there's sort of inner fractures and little pieces of liquid that look like sort of fiery smoke. The ancient Japanese called the breath of the white dragon. And I call them sort of fairy frost. And for me, that's what takes my mind away. Because when I look at them, I get very sort of mesmerized, and I think it really calms an active mind. So that's what I was using in lockdown to take my mind away. And I think what stones are so good at is that sort of calming element, and filling them with that intention of what you want. If you want to be calmer, to use it in that way, and cumulatively, every time you use it in that way, and you are thinking of that thing that you want, in time you'll have a new default response to something that might have frightened you or scared you before. Slowly you can somehow remind yourself always to be less fearful of it and to be calmer. And I don't believe there was anyone at the beginning of the first lockdown who didn't feel anxiety in some form. I think we were all in it together. Yeah. And I think what's very an interesting statistic is that I think only 10% of what we feel is from external factors, but 40% is our thoughts and actions. And I think those are things you can change. And so that's what I was trying to do with my rock crystal in lockdown, was to change that feeling of fear, to give myself a brighter outlook and sort of contain the gloom of the headlines, that it didn't overwhelm you, and that to keep that at bay. And I think that rock crystal does that. And when I think about it, it's really its underground journey that gives it that inner life, that absorbs you, and how important that underground journey is. And I wondered if you felt the same, Pippa, about that, because we read so much now about stones, not just diamonds, other stones grown in labs and created. And I wondered what you felt about their journey.
Both holding ourselves. Well, I think the lab-grown stones is a very interesting one, because you have so many interesting debates around it. There's, of course, probably most importantly, the environmental impact. And I mean, certainly in diamond mining, I don't know enough about it, but I have read a little bit, and I understand that in terms of the energy used to create a diamond in a lab, it's quite intense. But there are companies who are either moving towards or will move towards or started renewable energy for that tremendous kind of pressure that's needed to create the diamond artificially. I think the impact of diamond mines, both environmentally, in terms of human rights and things, has been terrible over the last hundreds of years. I think it's an extraordinary thing that they can produce something, but it's really difficult because I think that's where it's about the subtle area of intention. If we're looking at quite a large percentage of diamonds mined are used for industrial use, so they're for abrasive material for industrial machinery and so forth. I mean, an area like that, if these can be lab produced, how fantastic, because you know that certainly clears the way of a lot of mining that is huge areas of land and massive turnover of earth for a single diamond. So I mean, I think if it can be used for that, fantastic. The intention of a diamond as an emotional, or if you look in like the Vedic tradition as a kind of as a cultural or a sacred or a stone full of symbol, I think it's very hard to use a lab-grown diamond for that. I mean, in the sense of, someone told me the other day that AI can now, artificial intelligence can now write poetry, and I thought, how interesting. You can write a poem, a machine can write a poem. It's probably technically perfect, maybe it rhymes, I don't know quite how they do it, but a machine does not have human experience or human emotion or all the incredible things, lifetime, the experience that go into creating a line of poetry. So why would we read a machine's poem? It's sort of, to me, they somehow compare. It's sort of a diamond that's been grown in a lab. I'm not sure I would want to wear one. And I'm not sure if my intention with wearing the stone, if it's an emotional gift, which, I mean, jewelry is an emotional attachment, otherwise we wouldn't own it and wear it. I think there's something there that I find quite puzzling, because I understand that millennials are turning more towards lab-grown stones, and their concern is environment, and I think that's fantastic. But I think it depends, if you're wanting lab diamonds for, you know, a glittering, amazing accessory or a jewel that's just for show, great. If you want it for that engagement ring or for some really meaningful thing, I would probably prefer a stone from the earth. And that again relates back to looking at the Vedic tradition, where in the belief in the Navratna is a 9-gem, the sacred 9 gems that are related to planets. This is a really ancient belief system. It's an amulet that goes back centuries. And it's such a complex microcosm of the entire universe. It's kind of, it relates back to sound and foods and color and moods and music, and it sort of encompasses everything. But gems are a huge part of it. And I think if you were to look at that as a talisman, this idea that the Navratna is so complex.
Yes, it is.
But the idea is that each gem relates to a particular planet of the 9 known planets and the moon rising and setting. And the idea is that when you're born, these planets are in a certain alignment. I mean, these are such ancient beliefs, but you know, we believe in astrology. These things are not irrelevant in our culture today. But depending how they're formed when you're born, you might have too much Mercury or too little Mars, and these will influence how your life is. So the idea is you wear these 9 gems open at the back so they touch the skin. And this will, like an insurance policy, this will kind of ensure that the qualities of those different planets are balanced up and are equally measured, and it brings good fortune and keeps away the bad. And that's a kind of very intrinsic belief system, which, having worked in India for 30 years now, I always find it amazing how man, woman, child, street sweeper, prince, merchant, everybody wears a piece of jewelry. It's kind of inconceivable to see anybody in India without a piece of string with I don't know, a god in silver or gold, or an arm piece with some gem in it. And it's so interesting to see jewelry where it's a culture that doesn't wear the jewelry per se for power, prestige, or status. They're wearing it because it is essential to wear it. It's important to connect to those divinities or to those planets that are really, the belief is they're really impacting their lives. And a pundit or priest will tell you which stone you should wear, and it's not just that you should wear any yellow sapphire, but this particular yellow sapphire. And I think there's an amazing, story of blue sapphires in India, in the Vedic tradition. They're particularly powerful, but they can be malevolent if they're the wrong stone for you, or they can be positive. And you have to know whether it suits you or not. But for example, if you're told you should wear a sapphire, there's a whole kind of chain of rituals, which can start with choosing a stone, but then wrapping that stone in silk and keeping the stone in silk away from you, but for a number of weeks. You then take that silk and you put it under your pillow to sleep, and you see how your dreams are, you analyze how your life is, and if good things are happening or not. And if so far all is good, you can then wear the stone, but probably the stone would need to be set in a certain carat gold and then put on at a certain hour of the day and then washed in milk. And it's like incredibly complicated. But the belief system around stones is so alive still, and it does change the way you perceive jewelry. It's just no longer a pretty sparkly thing. It's like, it's imbued with so much more. And I find that fascinating. And going back to lab stones, I think this would be an area where it'd be quite confusing, if that's your intention.
I think basically, for me, any stone removed from its history doesn't mean it's a stone. Yeah. And whether you can give something the same chemical makeup or not is sort of irrelevant. I feel they have to have that underground journey. That is the magic.
It is. And
made beneath the earth 100 million years ago, that's the magic.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I don't think I'd be very happy if someone gave me that. And where do you think that jewelry and healing and well-being, where do you think all that started? Where did that come from?
Well, I think it's it must go back to early man. And I talked to the contemporary artist Damien Hirst for the book, and he came up with, he's collected stones since he was 7. He loves stones. And he said that he, for his treasures exhibition in Venice, he added turquoise to his sculpture of the goddess Hathor, because she was the goddess of the miners. And he said, if you imagine being one of these sort of ancient Egyptians and seeing that turquoise came out of the earth and it was just formed like that, he said to make sense of it, you would have to think it was divine. Yeah. There would be no other explanation.
Especially in that desert environment, just brown sand and blue. Yeah.
And so I think that's probably one reason. I think the earliest document that we have, it was written in 1550 BC, and it's called the Ebers Papyrus, and it's the most ancient medical papyri that there is. And that documented how they would grind stones and create them into powders or ointments to feed or place on the patient. And emeralds were used as a laxative. Seems like a waste of a good emerald to me. And amethyst for snake bites, and each was sort of given their virtue, their special virtue to cure. And then I think the Romans continued that, and then later on, basically we had to rely on folklore. People had to write things down. They wrote down what they observed, and this went on even through Christianity. When Christianity arrived and they banned any superstitious practices, people still couldn't stop that ancient spiritual belief in stones. Yeah. And then in the Renaissance, really, it got to a lot of scholars started to the study of stones, and they had to amass great collections. So they had to look for wealthy patrons who could enable that for them. So they looked to wealthy aristocrats, and then they could study the collection, and that really was the beginning of the idea of the museum,
And science, in a
and
way.
science, linking science and art and nature. And there was one great example, which was Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was king of Croatia and Hungary and Archduke of Austria. And he had several chambers full of uncut gems and cabinets, cabinets of curiosities. And he had a physician, a court physician called Anselm de Bot, who studied the stones. And this is another sort of connection of where the sort of healing and stones came, because often these scholars were physicians, and so they would use plants and stones to cure their patron should he become ill. So there was sort of another good connection for using those stones. And Anselm de Bot actually wrote a medical treatise saying that you could cure a disease of the same color of the stone. So, i.e., if it was a blood disease, you used a red garnet. If it was your eyes, you used a lapis. And amazingly, that continued. And even in 1913, George Frederick Kunz, who wrote the curious Law of Precious Stones, wrote the same thing. He said, we have it proven, it's absolutely proven, that if you use a stone of the same color, it will exert an influence on the patient. And then he put a caveat and said, but there are a lot of other virtues given to stones that aren't true, so you shouldn't believe those. And the ancient Greeks believed that amethyst gave you a calm lucidity, and that would help people not to become under the evil influence of alcohol. And even then in 1750, the Borgias physician in Rome was writing that amethyst definitely helped stop inebriation. So some of these beliefs really, really carried through.
Yeah. Fascinating.
It really is interesting. And Paloma Picasso told me that when she was in New York in the 70s, people said, have an amethyst, it will help your hangover. So it's sort of, it keeps going in some form. But of course, we don't believe that now. And well, I say, personally, I don't believe that a stone can cure your migraine, but can it exert an influence on how you feel? Yes. And if it exerts an influence on how you feel, what I argue in the book is, if you're feeling more positive and better and you're calmer, you're going to make better decisions. And if you make better decisions, it's going to have a knock-on effect on your life. So I have got a lot of people's stories who have improved the trajectory of their life using stones as they perceive it.
That's fascinating. I have had stones that I've been told by various different sources, for example, that have a very negative feeling. And it might be, I mean, one was one of the first diamonds I ever bought in India, and two stone doctors told me that it had a very, very sad and a terrible kind of energy to it. Something tragic had happened. And they said that diamonds particularly are very energetic, and they hold the memory of the people who worn them. And this one, perhaps there'd been a death or something tragic, and that I was not to wear the ring, not to sell the ring, but to bury the ring. So there was my first diamond that I was so proud of, buried. And that was the end of that. But even then, they were, there was concern about where you buried it.
Where did you have to bury it? We'll all go looking for it.
Library is. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's again, the power of the stories of stones. And I think stories is so much what makes us human. And then these stories of the history of gems and our beliefs are so fascinating and make you look at a stone in a new way. But I think that's what we're all about, is stories. And that's how when designing or making jewelry, I think that it keeps coming back to that, whether it's the story of the maker or where it was made or why it was designed or where the stone came from or why you've said it that way, or that's all about the kind of why we wear them. Without story, it's kind of, as you say, the love diamond, it's without story. Why? Jewelry is not a functional, needed object. It's one thing we don't need to survive.
Well, I'd argue it's the thing we do need, and especially at the moment in this pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, who's been buying clothes? Why do you need new clothes to go wear? And actually, we do need to mark what we feel about loved ones. We do need, people are getting married. People do need something, a time that actually you do need jewelry.
Absolutely.
And
I think that's so true.
Is what people are buying.
Absolutely. It's an amazing thing to have seen that in the last few months. How people want, I had one man say that my wife has been so incredible, you know, running the house, keeping the children happy, blah, blah, blah. I want to get the best, biggest jewel I can find to thank her. And I was like, wow, it's really true. If we're gonna mark an occasion, it's a jewel that's going to say it most sort of particularly and succinctly.
And when people are coming into you, like this gentleman, are they looking for a stone that, are they coming in with a preconceived notion of, I need an amethyst because I think that's what she'd want? Are they aware of what they think the virtues and energies of a stone are?
Well, I think it's difficult. Men are very different to women when they buy. Firstly, I mean, a man's first question often is, how many carats is it? They've been told to ask that. They don't really know what it means, but how many carats?
Well, that's better than how much is it?
Then how much is it? But I think that in some men's eyes, there's a sort of sense of investment in buying a jewel, which certainly I'm not the designer for that, because I think there's the jewels and the stones we use are really more about stories and relationships and feeling and emotional response than how many carats question. But I think that there's definitely, if customers come in and they want to know about the properties of a particular stone, I do find it sometimes difficult to prescribe. I don't really feel I have the right to say this one will get rid of migraines or this one will improve your love life. I don't know that, but I know that, as you say, this stone, if they love it and feel braver and more confident to go out and face the world because it's on their body, then that's the stone for them. I think it's as simple as that, really. But yes, it's been an interesting time for Julian. It's really shown humans that it's such a time of questions of mortality and questions of very, very base emotions that we have turned to jewelry is so interesting. Says it all.
And the stones.
And the stones. The stones. Always the stones.
And I think that's something I've noticed as well was suddenly it was all around. I went into the offices of Vogue and the beauty director had a mass of stones on her desk and she'd change them every day, deciding, you know, depending how she felt. You know, a press release would come in from Miranda Carr, who's done a new beauty line using rose quartz. Victoria Beckham wouldn't start a fashion show without all the models having a bit of black tourmaline in their pocket to walk down the runway. She had a whole sort of ritual backstage. And you know, it wasn't just them, I would go to the fine jewelry launches, you know, Cartier in Paris suddenly would hold 2 years ago, they had a big new collection in the gem hall in Paris, the natural mineral hall in Paris. And it was like everybody suddenly was focused on the meanings of stones and using, as you say, these hard stones. Even if they were creating fine jewelry, they wanted the hard stones in with it. Somehow it was bringing this sort of extra element, this extra element of magic. So it just seems sort of bombarding. And I think that's another reason that I was sort of drawn to write about it, to see why suddenly there was this move towards stones. And I think when I spoke with Charlotte Tilbury, she blamed mobile phones. She said, our life is too fast now. And I think we are speeded up, we are hyperconnected, our day doesn't finish. And I think with speed does come euphoria, but also anxiety. And it is very sort of anxious making. And we've all read about and probably witnessed it with the people we know, that social media on young people can have quite a detrimental effect. And lockdown, we've been reading about people's mental health being compromised. And I think the speed of the world and the insecurity you know, and imagine when you're 16 and you see your best friends had a party on Instagram and you haven't been invited, and then you read the world's going to end because climate change is. It was if you survive the party, the climate change will, and then the pandemic will come. So I think for young people particularly, it's incredibly hard, and their gatekeeper is social media. Imagine that. The truth, where do they find truth? Where do they know? And how do they feel stability in their life? And so I'm sure that's a lot of what's propelled young people to this sort of new crystal obsessions.
It makes total sense. The stillness, the calmness, the unchangingness. Absolutely.
And the sense that it's come from the earth, that permanence, and the earth might not let them down.
Yeah.
They can rely on the earth, maybe not to let them down.
An optimistic link there. That's true. It's true.
And you have a lot of Labradorite around your neck. I love the story of Labradorite.
Labradorite's a fascinating one.
Yes.
I've got a mixture actually of shells, which have the same kind of flash as the Labradorites, and then labs in between. And that's kind of, I suppose my jewelry ritual is I kind of go through the year and I'll change bracelets and necklaces maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and I then sleep in them, swim in them, wherever I am, they're there, whether I'm in Kabul or Nairobi or London or Paris or wherever, it's the same jewels. I'm always told, don't wear those in the streets and wherever, and I'm kind of, I don't think anyone realizes it's gold or whatever, but anyway, so far they've protected me. But it's sort of, it goes with a kind of mood of, at this moment, it's winter coming, I think there's a time that's so complex. I mean, every day I wake and it's kind of maneuvering through, as you said, many, many different challenges. And there's something about Labradorite, I feel that sort of celebrates complexity and celebrates challenge, because it is a very complex stone itself. And the beauty of it is so overwhelming, I find, that somehow it feels the right stone for now. Perhaps shells too, because shells are protection. I mean, shells are there to keep you safe. So maybe there's a reason why I had the shells on too. But yeah, so that's kind of, this has been on since lockdown and will probably go until things change and maybe lighten, and then maybe the stones will turn to crystal or moonstone or something kind of lighter. But right now it feels like this heavy weight is the right thing, and the darker colors and the strange.
And the flash, it's that Schiller effect, isn't it? Where the molecular structure, it looks grey 1 minute, turn it a fraction of a millimeter, and suddenly it lights up with these incredible light effect, which is so exciting. I love the story behind that, because it was found along the Labrador coast in Canada, and the history was that the indigenous people felt that the northern lights had been trapped in the rocks, and that a traveling hunter had speared them to let them go, but some had got trapped in the rocks. And it's just such a lovely description.
It's so absolutely right. It's kind of, I've never seen the northern lights one day I grew up, but it's so true.
You carry them around with you anyway.
Yes. The trapped ones.
And the other thing I felt that was sort of going back to the past as well, which was like, as Damien Hirst had made for his treasure show in Venice, a sort of cabinet of curiosities. People are going back to that old idea of creating Kunstkammers, Wunderkammers. I call them mantelpiece minerals, a bit like I have them here, that you sort of have them how you want, keep them around you. And there are a lot of big art collectors as well, collecting huge, great sort of monolithic, great quartzes with terminated ends. And I think it's amazing that Pliny, the ancient historian in Greece, wrote that quartz and large quartzes, he said, their plays are more beautiful than any artwork could ever be. And I think it's rather amazing now that these art collectors are realizing the rarity, the extraordinary, unique thing of finding a stone like that. And they are hanging them as artworks or lighting them on a plinth. And it's sort of like everything about stones is sort of coming back and crystallized in this moment now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
All around us.
Amazing about that.
But I think I think the main thing in my book, I sort of direct, so I've chaptered it, as you know, into colours, and sort of suggest certain colours for certain moods, and given some people's experiences and talked about how the ancients used them. But I hope throughout the book it is use them how you want, how you feel, make your own perception, go with your own gut instinct, and figure out how you want to use it, because nothing's right and nothing's wrong. There are no rules. Exactly. And but used well and with some commitment, like any relationship, you have to commit to your stone, and it can have some very positive effects in your life, I think.
Absolutely. No, that's very true. I mean, also we were talking a little bit about how cutting stones or not cutting stones for jewelry, whether or not, for example, this pendant, which is a rough amethyst, all these kind of beautiful,
really beautiful
terminations, and they set in gold, or whether a stone perhaps retains more power, energy left this way, or whether faceted and cut. And I think there's beauty in both, but I think somehow to not entirely transform a stone and make it unrecognizable from its natural state, I think is something rather respectful perhaps, and it does feel like there's more energy in leaving a beautiful crystal rather than kind of cutting and polishing and altering it. I think it's still, of course, full of the beauty in a facet, but there's something also for certain stones incredibly powerful about the raw, completely untouched crystal.
I never like stones over-faceted. I feel like it's taking a beautiful cloth, which has got the most amazing pattern on, and then cutting it and embroidering it and fiddling with it. And I think sometimes stones, the less is more.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
That's true.
I mean, I've got just discs of moss agate on.
Is that what they are?
They're moss agate. And you see all the tendrils of inside. It's almost like a little forest inside the.
They're so magic, those ones.
I love them.
The dendritic kind of, completely enchanting. I mean, they do look like a miniature world that's frozen in a stone.
It's exactly
imagine
that.
again in the
and
ancients.
It's like frost on a window, isn't it? And then and the patterns it makes.
And they're all completely unique. You've never. I could just see this glimmer. I didn't know what they were.
You probably can't see them, but we'll describe them. But as you know, see, Pippa and I can go on about stones for hours. But I think at this point I should give the opportunity if anybody wanted to ask us any questions. We would be delighted to answer.
Yes, please do put questions if you have them in the chat and I can surface them up to Carol and Pippa. What a great conversation. I am just like, as always, madly scrolling down little bits and pieces and tidbits. Okay, we have a question. What type of energy does Alexandrite have? Personally interesting to me as well, given that it's my namesake.
That's interesting. Alexandrite is such a fascinating stone because this color change is just. I was told, not again that I can prescribe, but I was told it was a very powerful talisman for times of change, which would seem appropriate now as well. I suppose, you know, given the fact that it can change. I don't remember if it's light or heat that creates the change.
I think it's light.
The light. To go from this amazing green to red. And that's how, yes, I was told that as an amulet for change, to kind of keep you centered through that, but it was a wonderful stone for that. But a magical stone, you know, very rare. Very rare. Especially if it's beautiful.
I loved something that you were saying before about this kind of speed of the world. And this, I think what you were trying to unpack was this idea of like holding or, you know, feeling something physical when that is being removed from our everyday experience. And I think, you know, it kind of struck me when you were talking about your, you know, I don't want to say seasonal because that implies fashion, but, you know, like month-long stints of wearing the same thing, Pippa. I feel like in particular in this moment, do you feel that people are seeking to like replace some kind of physicality, because we are so digital right now with, you know, either stones or jewelry, or kind of adorning themselves with something that has a presence, not just clothing, you know?
That's absolutely, that's the basis of it all. It's a sense of our Earth, you know, the planet. Even that sort of diamonds are created is 100 miles below the surface of the Earth, and billions of years old. I mean, of course, the energy in any stone that's been created over such time, just so many combinations of chemicals and sand and heat and wind and water and all these elements. Of course, it's contained in that stone. I mean, it can't not be. So I think holding on to those absolutely is a way of us, as we're so far removed from any kind of nature or urban environments. Of course, it's a way of feeling that connection to our planet in the most fundamental way.
Mm.
Also, when we talk about fashion, I mean, everybody wears the same thing. You know, wherever we are, we're all wearing jeans and trainers, and what new trainers are coming out. But how do you have any sense of individuality? Something that's unique to you, that speaks about you and your life and who you are and where you're from and who you love, and it can tell. You know, a stone can have all of that information in you, around you, and that's how what you carry around and present yourself to the world with. And so I think it's really important, because I think in some cases doesn't do that so much for people now. Set us apart.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You know, I think you said this, Pippa, as well. You mentioned like jewelry ritual, and I don't like, I feel like we talk about that a lot, and I think there's a lot of association with stones in terms of ritual that is specific to the stones. But it's interesting to kind of, you know, put in parallel that with the act of jewelry, you know, like the act of participating, and not just in like a ritual in the more like traditional sense, but more like what do you do every day? We have another question here for you, Pippa. How do you select stones for your jewelry, and do you have a particular process around that?
I spend a lot of my life looking at stones and have done for years, to the point where I dream stones. I can close my eyes and see stones. And when I'm producing a collection, whether it's in India or in Myanmar or Afghanistan or wherever I'm working, I will have a table and I will just empty out packets of stones and just spend ages moving them very slightly, turning them over, tilting them. I mean, probably someone watching would just think, it's like this extraordinary moment when you are just so focused on these rocks and what they're going to become. I think you mentioned that too, you know, stone tells you what it's going to become. But I kind of start moving them around and making designs on the table. I don't really do sort of incredible technical drawings. I work very much from the stones I find and turn them into things because of what they are, rather than I have a preconceived idea and cut a stone to fit it and so forth. So it's all about the stones telling me what they're going to do. But it's literally will be all that time spent slightly hunched over with quite bad light, just looking, feeling, touching, moving, running my fingers through them. I mean, it's kind of heaven, really. I'm the luckiest person in the world. But that will sort of eventually, you know, kind of wind down into, you know, earrings, and it just kind of slowly evolves into designs. But it's just feeling the stones that ends up being.
I love that. And so many people have talked about dreaming things this week. It's a real theme that's emerging throughout Jewelry Week. I think Nina Runsdorf said earlier this week as well that she draws with stones as well. This like idea of, instead of kind of sketching, really like feeling something and kind of placing it in physical space, which I really love. That's just such amazing kind of insight. And yes, you are the luckiest person in the world to be with these stones.
That she talks to stones. And I have to say, that same conversation with Lucia Silvestri, the creative director of Bulgari, she said, I walk in and I say, buongiorno, and I talk to them and they talk back to me.
I was going to say, I do just talk.
And it is a dialogue. You do have a dialogue. I mean, I suppose I do it in the morning. I sort of look at, I have a lovely moonstone set by Pippa in yellow gold. And, you know, I'll look at that, or my moss agate, and you think, okay, whose turn today? and that dialogue.
Oh yeah, I love that. Like who's going to be with me today, bringing jewelry into the kind of the process of your everyday. Okay, that is sadly, very sadly, all that we have time for today in this conversation. Thank you both so much for being here and sharing all of this wonderful insight. You know, if only it were as easy as an amethyst to cure a hangover, I think we would all I think we would all enjoy it if that were in fact true. Exactly, yes. But thank you, Carol, and thank you, Pippa, so much for being here. We're so excited.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing.